Welcome back. Today we're starting week 12 and we're moving into one of the most misunderstood areas of research methods, correlation and regression. To understand why this matters, I want you to imagine you're scrolling through your news feed and you see this headline. Scientists find that eating chocolate is linked to winning Nobel Prizes. Your first reaction might be, chocolate makes you smarter? Should I be eating more chocolate to boost my research output? Well, this is a real correlation. In 2012, a researcher named Franz Messerli published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that countries with higher per capita chocolate consumption also have more Nobel Prize laureates per capita. The correlation was significant. The pattern was real. But here's the problem. Chocolate doesn't cause Nobel Prizes. And this study was published as a satire, a commentary on how easy it is to find correlations that mean absolutely nothing. So today we're going to understand what correlation actually tells us and what it doesn't tell us, and why this distinction matters every single time you read a research paper or see a claim about what's linked to what. Let's start with the basics. A correlation is a measure of how two continuous variables move together. When I say move together, I mean as one variable goes up, does the other tend to go up, go down, or stay roughly the same? The most common correlation we work with is called Pearson's R, or the Pearson correlation coefficient. Think of R as a number that tells you two things at once: the direction of the relationship and the strength of the relationship. Pearson's R ranges from -1 to +1. A value of +1 means a perfect, positive, linear relationship. If you plot the two variables on a scatterplot, every single data point falls exactly on an upward sloping line. A value of -1 means a perfect negative linear relationship. Every point falls exactly on a downward sloping line. And a value of 0 means no linear relationship at all. Now I want to emphasize that word, linear. Pearson's R measures whether the relationship follows a straight line. This is important, and I'll come back to it, because you can have a very strong relationship between two variables that doesn't look linear at all, and Pearson's R will make it look weak or even 0. What does correlation look like in practice? Well, if I collected data on students' hours spent studying and their exam scores, and I find R equals 0.7, that's a fairly strong positive correlation. Most students who study more do score higher, but not all of them. If I plot this, I'd see a cloud of points that trends upward from left to right, a meaningful pattern, but with clear variation around it. Now, compare that to R equals 0.3, a much weaker pattern, much more scatter, harder to detect in any individual case. And if R equals 0, that could mean there's genuinely no relationship, or, and this is crucial, it could mean there's a relationship, but it's not linear. Imagine plotting people's age against their lung capacity across a lifespan. Lungs grow through adolescence and early adulthood, then slowly decline in older age. That relationship is curved, shaped like an inverted U. The relationship is real and important, but Pearson's R might come out close to 0 because the line doesn't fit. This is why I'm going to tell you something you need to believe. Never trust a correlation without looking at the scatterplot. If you've been keeping up with the lectures, you'll remember Anscombe's Quartet from week 5B. We used it there to make the case for always visualizing your data before trusting your summary statistics. It's worth revisiting here because it makes the point perfectly in the context of correlation. It includes 4 different data sets, each with the same Pearson correlation coefficient, R equals 0.82. The same mean, the same standard deviation. Identical summary statistics. But when you plot them, one shows a clear positive linear trend. A second is perfectly curved. The relationship exists, but no line captures it. A third has a tight horizontal cluster with a single extreme point off to the side, which is entirely driving the coefficient. The point is simple. R alone doesn't tell you enough to interpret the relationship. You need to see the scatterplot. A number by itself can be radically misleading about the actual pattern in your data. So how strong does a correlation need to be to matter? This is where a lot of misunderstanding happens, so I'm going to be direct about it. You may have seen Cohen's benchmarks. R equals 0.1 is small, R equals 0.3 is medium, and R of equal 0.5 is large. Useful heuristics, but here's what people often get wrong. They think a small correlation is not worth reporting, that it's almost useless. That's not true, and it's a misconception I want you to shake off right now. Let me give you a concrete example. Researchers measure sleep quality and mood the next day in 1,000 participants. They find R equals 0.12, statistically significant at p less than 0.001. A small correlation by Cohen standards, but think about it this way. Mood is influenced by hundreds of variables: genetics, recent life events, hormones, time of day, caffeine, social interactions, physical health. Any single factor is going to have a small correlation with mood. Sleep is one piece of a very large puzzle. An R of 0.12 means sleep quality predicts about 1% of the variation in mood the next day because you square R to get the proportion of variance explained. That 1% might sound tiny, but if improving sleep shifts mood even a little, and that effect applies to thousands of people, it matters. What counts as meaningful depends entirely on the domain. In medical research, you might demand R greater than 0.7. In social psychology or education, where behavior is shaped by so many factors, R equals 0.3 is actually quite respectable. The benchmarks are useful starting points. They're not substitutes for thinking about what the effect means in context. Now, you've seen this distinction in weeks 9 and 10, so I'll move quickly, but it applies directly here too. When we calculate a correlation, we also calculate a p-value. If there were truly no relationship, what's the probability we'd see a correlation this strong by chance? A small p-value tells us the correlation is statistically significant, unlikely to be a fluke. But statistical significance is not the same as practical importance. That sleep and mood example, the R equals 0.12, p less than 0.001, statistically significant with 1,000 people. Whether it's practically important is a separate question you have to answer by thinking about the context and the domain, not by reading the p-value. The full picture here is, look at the correlation, look at its significance, and think about the effect size in context. Never stop at p less than 0.05. And here's where we get to the heart of why the chocolate and Nobel Prize correlation is such a good example. Let's return to it. Higher chocolate consumption is correlated with more Nobel Prize winners. The correlation is real, but chocolate doesn't cause Nobel Prizes. Why? Well, the answer is the third variable problem. When two variables are correlated, there are always three possible explanations. First, X causes Y. Second, Y causes X. And third, and this is the one people forget, Z causes both X and Y. In the chocolate case, the third variable is per capita wealth. Wealthier countries can afford more chocolate. Wealthier countries also invest more heavily in education and research, which produces more Nobel laureates. The correlation between chocolate and Nobel Prizes is spurious, driven entirely by the third variable. This is not a rare problem. It's everywhere. Ice cream sales and drowning deaths are positively correlated. More ice cream is sold in summer, and more people drown in summer. But ice cream doesn't cause drowning. The third variable is temperature. Warmer weather drives both. Here's a more psychological example. Researchers find that students who use their phones more during study sessions tend to have lower exam scores. Does phone use cause lower grades? That's the intuitive interpretation, but here's an alternative. Students who are struggling academically might use their phones as a distraction or a coping mechanism. Or maybe a third variable, conscientiousness, affects both phone use and academic performance at the same time. Correlation doesn't tell you the causal direction. It doesn't tell you whether there's a third variable lurking. Without experimental manipulation, without randomly assigning people to conditions, you cannot determine causation from a correlation alone. A correlation can be an excellent starting point for a hypothesis, but it cannot be the endpoint for a causal claim. Beyond the third variable problem, there are three other patterns worth knowing. Let me move through them quickly. Restriction of range. If you investigate ATAR scores and university GPA at an elite university, where almost everyone scored high on the ATAR, the correlation drops dramatically, maybe from R equals 0.5 to R equals 0.2. Why? Because you've restricted the range of one variable. With little variation in ATAR scores, they can't explain much variation in GPA. If you're reading research with a restricted or selective sample, remember that the correlation you see may be artificially low. Outliers. Pearson's R is sensitive to extreme data points. In a study of education and income, one tech billionaire who dropped out of high school can pull the regression line and substantially change the correlation coefficient. This is why looking at the scatterplot matters. Outliers reveal themselves visually in a way that a single number never can. Nonlinear relationships. Suppose exercise frequency and life satisfaction followed an inverted U-curve. People who have no exercise, they have moderate satisfaction. 3 times a week yields high satisfaction. And people who exercise every day, that yields moderate satisfaction again. Now, Pearson's R might come out to 0.1 or 0, even though the relationship is real and strong. The number doesn't capture curved patterns. Describe them, visualize them, and consider whether the correlation coefficient is even the right tool. I mentioned spurious correlations a moment ago. Let me illustrate just how absurd they can get. There's a website called tylervegan.com that documents correlations between totally unrelated variables. The number of Nicolas Cage films released per year is correlated with the number of people who die by drowning in swimming pools. The divorce rate in Maine is correlated with the per capita consumption of margarine. The correlations are real in the data, but there's no plausible mechanism connecting them. It's pure coincidence, and we have enough variables in the world that some will correlate by chance alone. This brings us to something fundamental. Science doesn't just hunt for correlations, it thinks about mechanism. Before you get excited about a correlation, ask whether there's a plausible pathway. Does it make theoretical sense that X and Y would be related? Have other researchers found similar patterns? A single surprising correlation in one study is much less convincing than a correlational pattern that replicates across multiple studies, makes theoretical sense, and fits with other lines of evidence. Mechanism is what separates a meaningful finding from a statistical coincidence. Quick check. Here's the question. You're reading a paper that reports that R equals 0.12, P equals 0.001, the N equals 1,000. What does this tell you? A, the correlation is strong. B, the correlation is statistically significant, but the effect size is small. C, the result is practically important. Or D, you should not trust this finding without looking at the scatter plot. The best answer is B and D together. With 1,000 people, R equals 0.12 is very unlikely to be a fluke. That's what the p-value tells you. But 0.12 is a small effect size. Whether it's practically important depends on context. And you absolutely should look at the scatter plot. A number alone doesn't reveal outliers, nonlinearity, or other patterns that change how you'd interpret the end result. So now you understand correlation, how to measure it, how to interpret the strength, and why a significant correlation tells you nothing about causation. Next, we build on this foundation. We're going to ask, if we have a correlation, can we use it to predict? And what does it mean to say a variable explains variation in another? We're moving into regression. It's a tool for prediction, and it's often misused as a tool for explanation. That distinction is where we're going next. See you then. Bye.